After World War II, people expected peace, but what came instead was rage. Across Europe and beyond, people were dragged into the streets, and they were not German soldiers, but locals who had helped the Nazis rule. What followed was a brutal revenge that shocked even those who had survived the war itself. Back when World War II began in September 1939, most people across Europe were not thinking about ideology or loyalty. Daily life was already hard. Many countries were still recovering from the Great Depression. People were scared long before the first bomb fell. Then on September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland from the west. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. The Polish army was overwhelmed in weeks. Warsaw fell by the end of September. The Polish state collapsed almost overnight. Millions of civilians suddenly found themselves living under foreign rule, with no protection and no clear future. The German occupation of Poland was harsh from the very beginning. Public executions started early. Polish leaders, teachers, priests, and officers were arrested or killed. German authorities knew they could not control such a large population alone. They needed local help to identify enemies and keep order. This pattern repeated as Germany expanded across Europe. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered in one day. Norway resisted longer but fell by June. In May 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Paris fell on June 14, 1940. France officially surrendered on June 22nd. By the end of 1940, most of Western Europe was under German control. Germany ruled these territories with limited manpower. German soldiers were needed at the front lines. The Nazi system depended on locals who knew the language and the neighborhoods. Local cooperation appeared quickly. In France, the Vichy government was formed in July 1940 and openly worked with Germany. In Norway, Vidkun Quisling formed a collaborationist government. In the Netherlands and Belgium, local administrators continued operating under German supervision. In Eastern Europe, where German rule replaced Soviet control in some areas, local forces were recruited even faster. People chose collaboration for many reasons. Fear was the most common. Refusing orders could still lead to prison, deportation, or death. Some believed cooperation would protect their families. Others saw opportunity. The Germans offered jobs, food rations, housing, and power. For men with no status before the war, collaboration meant authority. Ideology also played a role. In some regions, anti-communism, anti-Semitism, or extreme nationalism aligned with Nazi beliefs. In places like Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and Croatia, some groups believed Nazi rule would bring independence or revenge against past enemies. The Nazis formalized this cooperation. Local men were recruited into auxiliary police units. Others became camp guards, railway workers, clerks, translators, and informers. These roles placed them directly between the occupiers and the population. Informers were especially important. They reported hidden Jews, resistance members, and political opponents. A single accusation could lead to arrest or execution. In small towns, everyone knew who gave names to the Germans. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This operation was the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. This moment changed the nature of war and the role of collaborators forever. The invasion was ideological. Nazi leaders viewed the war in the East as a racial war. Entire populations were marked for destruction. Behind the front lines, mass killings began almost immediately. Special mobile killing units followed the German army. Their job was to eliminate Jews, communist officials, Roma people, and anyone considered a threat. These units were small and relied heavily on local help. In Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, local police units were formed or expanded. These forces rounded up Jewish families, guarded detention sites, and transported victims to execution locations. Many also participated directly in shootings. One of the most famous killings happened at Babin Yar, a ravine near Kiev, on September 29th and 30th, 1941. Over 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered there. Local police helped enforce curfews and escort victims to the site. In Lithuania, collaboration turned violent even before full German control was established. In Kaunas, during June 1941, local militias attacked Jewish communities. Thousands were beaten or killed in public spaces. These attacks were organized by local extremists who believed violence would earn German approval. Similar events occurred in Latvia and western Ukraine. Synagogues were burned. Jewish neighborhoods were destroyed. Local collaborators often knew exactly where families lived. In Western Europe, mass shootings were less common, but collaboration still led to death. In France, the Vichy government passed anti-Semitic laws without German pressure. French police played a central role in the arrests. On July 16th and 17th, 1942, more than 13,000 Jews were arrested in Paris during the Veldiv roundup. Many were children. German forces were barely visible there. Most of those arrested were deported to Auschwitz. Very few survived. In the Balkans, collaboration reached extreme levels. In Croatia, the Ustaše regime ruled as a Nazi ally. They created their own system of camps and executions. Jasenovac became the center of mass murder. Victims included Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political opponents. Killings were carried out by local forces using brutal methods. But then came Germany's defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, where more than 300,000 German and Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. News of the defeat spread quickly, even in censored territories. Yet the resistance movements grew bolder. In France, underground networks increased sabotage of railways, power lines, and supply depots. In Poland, the Home Army expanded its reach. In Yugoslavia, partisan forces controlled entire regions. Allied bombings also intensified in 1943-1944. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, Milan, and Turin were hit repeatedly. Civilian deaths rose sharply. Food shortages worsened. German authorities responded with harsher rules, curfews, and executions. Every attack by the resistance was met with mass punishment. Entire villages were burned, hostages were shot. Collaborators found themselves in a very dangerous position. They were hated by their own communities, but still depended on German protection. As German forces weakened, that protection became less reliable. They knew that once the Germans left, there would be no shield between them and the people they'd betrayed. Some of them responded with increased violence. They believed that showing loyalty would secure German support until the end. In reality, it only deepened local hatred and ensured they would be remembered. Others tried to hide their crimes. Documents were destroyed. Uniforms were burned or buried. Some collaborators suddenly claimed they had only followed orders or held minor roles. A few attempted to secretly contact resistance groups, hoping for forgiveness. These efforts rarely worked. Many collaborators chose to flee. As German troops pulled back, collaborators followed them westward. Police units, militia members, and informers packed up and left with retreating forces. Roads were filled with columns of soldiers and civilians trying to escape what they knew was coming. Italy became a clear example of this chaos. In July 1943, Benito Mussolini was removed from power. Italy later switched sides, but Germany quickly occupied much of the country. This split Italy in two. Fascist loyalists worked with German forces, while Italian partisans fought them. The result was a brutal civil war. Collaborators helped Germans locate partisans, leading to executions and village massacres. In return, Partisans captured and executed known collaborators. Violence became personal and constant. In France, resistance groups began preparing for liberation long before Allied troops arrived. They gathered information quietly and carefully. Names of collaborators were recorded. Details about arrests, denunciations, and killings were written down. In Eastern Europe, the situation was even harsher. Partisan warfare expanded across forests, mountains, and rural areas. German forces responded with scorched earth tactics. Villages suspected of helping partisans were destroyed. Civilians were executed publicly. Collaborators often acted as guides, leading German units to hidden camps and safe houses. These betrayals were witnessed by entire communities. By early 1944, it was clear that German power was collapsing. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet army pushed west with overwhelming force. Front lines moved quickly. German authority vanished almost overnight in some areas. What remained were people who had worked with the occupiers. They were all suddenly visible and unprotected. There was no longer a German uniform standing behind them. In many places, there was no functioning government at all. Courts weren't operating. Police forces had either fled, collapsed, or were themselves accused of collaboration. Power fell into the hands of resistance groups and armed civilians. In France, this moment began in the summer of 1944, especially after the Normandy landings in June. As towns were liberated, resistance fighters took control before the national government returned. This period became known as the Épuration Sauvage, meaning uncontrolled cleansing. It was not organized by courts or laws. It was driven by memory and anger. Suspected collaborators were arrested in homes, streets, and workplaces. Some were interrogated briefly. Many weren't questioned at all. People were executed in public squares. Bodies were sometimes left on display as warnings. Historians estimate that around 10,000 people were killed in France during this period, without any legal trial. Women accused of having relationships with German soldiers were singled out. These accusations didn't require proof. Public punishments were carried out in front of neighbors. Heads were shaved. Faces were marked. Women were paraded through the streets while crowds shouted and struck them. These acts were meant to shame, but they also served as a release for public rage after years of humiliation. Some women were imprisoned. Others were beaten severely. In a small number of cases, women were executed, especially if they were accused of informing on resistance members. In Belgium and the Netherlands, liberation followed a similar pattern. Resistance groups arrested collaborators quickly. Detention centers filled overnight. In rural areas, executions happened before any central authority could intervene. In Norway, collaborators connected to the collaborationist government were arrested as German forces withdrew. Members of the local Nazi party were beaten, imprisoned, or executed. Vidkun Quisling, the head of the collaborationist regime, was arrested in May 1945. In Eastern Europe, the violence was much harsher. In Poland, underground resistance courts sentenced collaborators to death. Some executions followed quick hearings. Others were carried out by angry crowds. Informers and auxiliary police were often killed immediately after liberation. Croatia saw one of the most violent endings. As the war ended in May 1945, Ustaše forces and civilians fled toward Austria, hoping to surrender to the Western Allies. Many were captured by partisan forces along the way. Forced marches followed. Prisoners were executed in large groups. Tens of thousands were killed during these final weeks. Bodies were buried in mass graves, many of which were hidden for decades. Liberation had turned into bloodshed, but this was only the beginning. The Soviet Union arrived with its own system of power. Its goal was not to rebuild trust, but to secure total control over newly occupied territory. Soviet security forces moved in immediately behind the army. They carried lists prepared in advance. These lists named people accused of working with the Germans. Local collaborators, police officers, village officials, and translators were arrested in large numbers. Many were taken within days of the Soviet arrival. There was no effort to separate minor cooperation from major crimes. Association alone was enough. In the Baltic states, especially Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, repression was widespread. These regions had experienced both Soviet and German occupation. When the Soviets returned in 1944, they treated collaboration as both treason and political resistance. Thousands were arrested. Many were executed after brief interrogations. Others were sent to labor camps in the Soviet interior. Entire families were deported to Siberia and Central Asia. Children, elderly people, and women were taken along with the accused. Deportations often happened at night, with no warning. In Ukraine and Belarus, the situation was brutal. Local police units that had assisted German forces were targeted aggressively. Some were captured and executed publicly in town centers. Others were taken into custody and never seen again. Prison records were rarely kept. Many died in detention from starvation, illness, or execution. The Soviets also used collaboration accusations to remove political opponents. Nationalists, former resistance members who didn't align with communism, and community leaders were often labeled collaborators even when the evidence was weak. In Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, Soviet-backed governments took power between 1944 and 1946. These new regimes created people's courts to handle collaboration cases. Trials were fast and heavily controlled. Defense was limited or meaningless. Verdicts were often decided before hearings began, and sentences were severe. Executions in these countries were carried out as public demonstrations of the new order. Loyalty to the old regime or cooperation with Germany would not be forgiven. Yugoslavia followed a similar but independent path. Tito's partisan forces had already gained control by the end of the war. His government viewed collaboration as a crime against the nation. Large-scale purges followed. Members of collaborationist governments, local militias, and suspected sympathizers were arrested or killed. In many cases, no formal charges were announced. Executions were carried out quickly. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves across the countryside. Some victims were civilians whose only crime was working in administration or supplying food under German rule. Others were accused by neighbors or rivals. Once arrested, survival was unlikely. When governments officially returned from exile or were newly formed, they faced a dangerous situation. If order was not restored quickly, revenge killings could continue for years. Courts and laws were brought back not only to punish collaborators, but to stop chaos. New legal systems were created almost immediately. Special courts were set up to handle collaboration cases. Old laws were rewritten or expanded so that cooperation with the enemy became a criminal offense. These courts worked fast. Judges were under public pressure. Survivors wanted punishment. Families of the dead demanded justice. Calm decision-making was rare. France saw the largest number of investigations. Over 300,000 people were accused or investigated for some form of collaboration. These ranged from holding office under German rule to informing on neighbors. Around 120,000 cases went to trial. Many defendants were ordinary people, not famous figures. French courts handed down about 6,700 death sentences. However, not all were carried out. Many sentences were later reduced or pardoned as the government tried to stabilize the country. In the end, roughly 800 people were executed. Norway's most important trial was that of Vidkun Quisling. He had openly supported Nazi rule and helped German authorities control the country. His trial began in August 1945 and was closely followed by the public. Evidence of his actions was clear and well documented. He was found guilty of treason and executed in October 1945. In the Netherlands, Anton Mussert, leader of the Dutch Nazi Party, was arrested after the war. He had worked closely with German authorities and supported deportations. His trial lasted several months. He was found guilty of high treason and executed in May 1946. Belgium followed a similar path. Tens of thousands were investigated. Thousands were imprisoned. Courts issued dozens of death sentences. Executions were carried out, though in smaller numbers than in France. Many sentences were later reduced as public anger slowly cooled. Despite the return of courts and laws, emotions still shaped outcomes. Trials were influenced by public memory and fear. Some people were punished harshly for minor cooperation. Others escaped severe punishment despite serious crimes. Perfect justice was impossible in such a damaged society. The war had ended, but the story did not end in Europe. In many parts of the world, occupation had created the same conditions of fear, betrayal, and survival. When foreign control collapsed, anger exploded in similar ways. Greece became one of the clearest examples. After German forces withdrew in late 1944, the country did not unite. Instead, old wounds opened immediately. During the occupation, many Greeks had worked with German authorities. Others had joined resistance groups, many of them communist-led. When the occupiers left, these two sides turned on each other. Suspected collaborators were hunted down in towns and villages. Some were executed by resistance fighters without trial. Others were killed by rival groups who accused them of aiding the enemy. At the same time, anti-communist forces targeted people linked to left-wing resistance. This violence quickly grew into a full civil war that lasted until 1949. Thousands died, many of them accused collaborators who never faced a formal court. In Asia, the collapse of Japanese control created similar chaos. Japan had occupied large parts of China, Korea, and Southeast Asia for years. Local collaborators had helped enforce Japanese rule, often serving as police, guards, or administrators. These collaborators were deeply hated by their communities. In China, as Japanese forces surrendered in 1945, local mobs attacked people accused of working with the occupiers. Some were beaten to death in public. Others were dragged from their homes and executed without investigation. In rural areas, accusations spread quickly, often based on personal grudges or rumors. Korea faced a painful reckoning as well. After decades of Japanese rule, collaborators were seen as traitors to the nation. In the months following liberation in August 1945, many suspected collaborators were attacked by angry crowds. Some were killed before any government could establish authority. Later attempts to hold trials were uneven and deeply political. Across Southeast Asia, the pattern repeated. In places like Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, people who had worked with Japanese authorities were targeted. Resistance groups and civilians carried out executions. In all these regions, the same forces were at work. Occupation forced people into impossible choices. Some cooperated to survive. Others resisted and suffered. When the occupiers left, the anger of years had no outlet except violence. With no strong courts or stable governments, mobs filled the gap. By around 1948, most of this uncontrolled killing began to slow down. New governments formed. Courts were established. Laws replaced fists and guns. Trials became more common than executions carried out by crowds. But the damage couldn't be undone. Families were destroyed. Communities were divided forever. People learned to stay silent about the past. The memories of who helped the enemy and who punished them never disappeared.